Picture this: a bustling English market square in 1832, filled with the usual vendors selling vegetables, livestock, and household goods. But today, there's something different about the crowd gathering near the old stone platform. They're not here for cattle or grain. They're here to watch Thomas Hardy sell his wife Sarah to the highest bidder. This wasn't some underground criminal activity hidden in dark alleys. This was a legal, publicly sanctioned transaction taking place in broad daylight, with local magistrates often in attendance. Sarah Hardy stood on that platform with a halter rope around her neck, just like the cattle sold hours earlier, while her husband announced her qualities to potential buyers. "She's a good worker, can cook, clean, and bear children," Thomas called out to the crowd. "Started at 5 shillings. Who'll give me 10? The bidding continued as Sarah stood there, tears streaming down her face, while neighbors she'd known for years examined her teeth, felt her arms for strength, and discussed her childbearing potential as if she were livestock. The winning bid came from James Morrison, a local blacksmith who paid 12 shillings and sixpence for Sarah. The transaction was recorded in the town ledger, making it completely legal under English common law. Sarah was handed over with a bill of sale, just like any other piece of property. The crowd dispersed, satisfied with the morning's entertainment, while Sarah was led away to her new life as Morrison's property. But what makes this even more disturbing is that these wife sales weren't rare occurrences. Between 1750 and 1900, historians have documented over 300 such public auctions across England. Women were sold in market squares, at crossroads, and even outside churches after Sunday services. The prices ranged from a few pence to several pounds, depending on the woman's age, health, and perceived usefulness. The process was always the same. The husband would lead his wife to a public place with a rope or chain around her neck, symbolizing her status as property. He would then auction her off to the highest bidder, often including her personal belongings in the sale. The buyer would receive a handwritten receipt, and the transaction was considered legally binding. What's truly horrifying is how normalized this practice had become. Newspaper advertisements would announce upcoming wife sales like any other public auction. To be sold by auction at the White Horse Inn, a wife, warranted sound in wind and limb, and quiet in harness, read one typical advertisement from 1796. The women had no legal recourse to prevent these sales. Under the doctrine of coverture, married women had no legal identity separate from their husbands. They couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even file complaints against their treatment. Once sold, they became the complete property of their new owner, who could treat them however he pleased. But these public spectacles of human degradation were just the tip of a much larger and more sinister iceberg that permeated every level of Victorian society. While the marketplace wife sales shocked observers with their brutal honesty, they were actually the least systematic part of a much larger machine that treated women as commodities. Behind the scenes, an entire legal and social apparatus had evolved to facilitate the buying and selling of women through arranged marriages, dowry negotiations, and what amounted to human trafficking with government approval. The Victorian marriage market operated on principles that would make modern human traffickers envious. Wealthy families maintained detailed records of available women, complete with financial assessments, health reports, and breeding potential evaluations. These weren't informal matchmaking efforts. These were calculated business transactions involving lawyers, banks, and government officials. Consider the case of Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of a moderately wealthy merchant family in 1847. When her father's business began failing, Eleanor became the family's most valuable asset. Her parents hired a marriage broker, a legitimate profession at the time, who created what amounted to a sales portfolio for Eleanor. The document detailed her dowry potential, her education, her health history, and even included character references from family servants. The broker, Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, operated from a respectable office in London's financial district. She maintained catalogues of available women, organized by social class, dowry size, and special attributes. Prospective husbands could browse these catalogs like modern real estate listings, selecting women based on their financial and physical specifications. Eleanor's entry read, Miss E. Whitmore, age 19, excellent health, trained in domestic management, modest dowry of $500, suitable for gentlemen of moderate means seeking industrious wife. Below this clinical description were detailed measurements, an assessment of her teeth and complexion, and a note about her docile temperament. The negotiation process was entirely handled between the families and their representatives, with Eleanor having no say in the proceedings. When Lord Pemberton expressed interest, the families exchanged detailed financial documents, medical histories, and legal agreements that spelled out exactly what was being purchased and sold. The marriage contract was a masterpiece of legal possession. Pemberton wasn't just marrying Eleanor, he was acquiring her labor, her reproductive capacity, her inheritance rights, and complete control over her future earnings. The document specified that Eleanor would forfeit any claim to her father's estate upon marriage, transferring those rights directly to her husband. But the most disturbing aspect was the inspection process. Before finalizing the deal, Pemberton exercised his right to examine his potential purchase. Eleanor was subjected to a humiliating physical examination by Pemberton's family physician, who checked her for diseases, assessed her fertility, and even examined her teeth like a horse buyer. The doctor's report, preserved in family archives, reads like a livestock assessment. Subject appears healthy and well-formed, teeth in good condition, hip structure suitable for childbearing, no obvious physical defects. Temperament appears suitable for domestic obedience. This system was so entrenched that government officials actively participated in facilitating these transactions. Marriage licenses required detailed financial disclosures, and tax assessors would evaluate the marital assets being transferred. Local magistrates routinely enforced the terms of these marriage contracts, treating women's disobedience as breach of contract. The legal framework supporting this trade was extensive and sophisticated. Courts regularly heard cases involving defective wives, where husbands sought compensation for women who failed to meet their contractual obligations. If a wife couldn't produce children, became ill, or proved unsuitable in other ways, her family could be sued for misrepresentation. Eleanor's story ended as predictably as it began. After producing 3 children and losing 2 to childhood diseases, she developed what we would now recognize as severe depression. Pemberton petitioned the courts to have her declared mentally defective, seeking to annul the marriage and recover his investment from her family. The case dragged on for 2 years, during which Eleanor was confined to her room and examined by multiple physicians who documented her failure to maintain proper wifely enthusiasm. The court ultimately ruled in Pemberton's favor, ordering Eleanor's family to compensate him for his losses while Eleanor herself was committed to an asylum. But what happened to the women who discovered these arrangements and tried to resist them would prove even more horrifying than the system itself. Behind the respectable facades of Victorian finishing schools and women's academies lay institutions that operated more like human processing plants than educational establishments. These bride factories systematically broke down young women's personalities and rebuilt them into the perfect submissive commodities that the marriage market demanded. The Pemberton Academy for Young Ladies in Bath appeared to be everything a respectable family could want for their daughters. The building was elegant, the grounds were manicured, and the curriculum promised to produce refined ladies of impeccable character. But what happened inside those walls was a calculated campaign of psychological destruction, designed to create women who would never question their fate as purchased property. Miss Charlotte Harrington arrived at Pemberton Academy in 1851 at age 14, the daughter of a country pastor who had scraped together the fees, hoping to secure his daughter's future. What Charlotte didn't know was that her father had essentially sold her to the academy, which operated on a profit-sharing model with the families who purchased their graduates. The education began immediately with the submission protocol. New arrivals were stripped of their personal belongings, their own clothes, and even their names. Charlotte became Subject 47, a designation that would follow her throughout her training. The girls were told that their previous identities were selfish and prideful, obstacles to becoming the perfect wives their future husbands deserved. The daily routine was designed to break any trace of independent thought. The girls rose at 4 a.m. for reflection time, which consisted of kneeling silently in the cold chapel while reciting mantras about their inherent worthlessness and need for male guidance. Breakfast was a watery porridge, served in measured portions, with seconds available only to those who demonstrated proper gratitude and humility. The curriculum itself was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Instead of literature, the girls studied domestic efficiency, which taught them to anticipate a man's needs before he expressed them. Mathematics was replaced with household economics, focused entirely on managing servants and stretching household budgets to maximize their husband's comfort. But the most insidious aspect was the personality reformation sessions. Twice daily, the girls were subjected to group sessions where any display of independent thought, creativity, or personal ambition was publicly shamed and punished. Charlotte made the mistake of expressing interest in her father's library during one of these sessions and found herself spending 3 days in the reflection chamber, a windowless room barely large enough to stand in. The physical conditioning was equally brutal. The girls were trained to move in ways that emphasized their submission, keeping their eyes downcast, speaking only when spoken to, and positioning their bodies to signal availability and compliance. They practiced walking with books balanced on their heads while maintaining expressions of vacant contentment, learning to smile, even while experiencing discomfort or fear. The Academy's medical program involved regular examinations that were really assessments of the girls' value as breeding stock. Dr. Nathaniel Grimsby, the Academy's physician, maintained detailed files on each girl's physical development, noting their potential for childbearing and rating their attractiveness on a standardized scale. These medical records were later shared with prospective purchasers. Charlotte's file, discovered years later in estate papers, reveals the clinical brutality of this assessment. Subject 47 shows acceptable development for breeding purposes. Hip structure adequate. Complexion fair but requires improvement. Temperament still shows traces of independence that must be corrected before graduation. The correction methods were medieval in their cruelty. Girls who showed signs of rebellion were subjected to therapeutic fasting, forced to subsist on bread and water while performing extra labor. More serious infractions resulted in the cold treatment, where girls were stripped and left in unheated rooms for hours while being lectured about their selfishness and ingratitude. The Academy also employed what they called reality training, where girls were subjected to scenarios designed to teach them their proper place. They might be forced to serve meals to male visitors while enduring intentional humiliation, or made to clean the same room repeatedly while being criticized for their incompetence. The goal was to condition them to accept degradation as normal and deserved. As graduation approached, the girls underwent final quality assessments. This involved a week-long process where they were examined, tested, and rated by the Academy's staff. The results determined their placement in the marriage market, with the highest-rated girls reserved for wealthy clients while the failures were sold to lower-class buyers, or in some cases, to brothels. Charlotte's assessment rated her as suitable for middle-class placement with continued supervision. Her independent streak had been noted but not entirely eliminated, making her a risky investment for premium buyers. She was marketed to families looking for a wife who could manage a household but wouldn't challenge her husband's authority in more serious matters. The graduation ceremony was a grotesque parody of normal academic celebrations. Instead of celebrating achievements, the families came to inspect their investments and finalize purchase agreements. Charlotte stood in a receiving line while potential buyers examined her posture, tested her responses to commands, and discussed her qualities as if she weren't present. But what these institutions couldn't control was what happened when some women discovered the truth about their conditioning and tried to fight back against the system that had created them. Not all women accepted their fate quietly. As the Victorian marriage trade reached its peak in the 1860s, a small but determined group of women began to understand what had been done to them and fought back with a desperation born of absolute horror. Their resistance would be met with punishments so severe that they served as warnings to any other woman who might consider rebellion. Anna Blackwood had been one of Pemberton Academy's success stories. Sold to a wealthy textile manufacturer named Reginald Crawford in 1863, she had initially performed her role perfectly. She managed his household efficiently, bore him 2 children, and maintained the submissive demeanor that her training had ingrained. But 3 years into her marriage, Anna began to remember who she had been before the academy, and the realization of what had been stolen from her ignited a rage that would consume her life. The awakening began when Anna discovered Crawford's business correspondence, which included detailed receipts for her purchase and ongoing payments to Pemberton Academy for her behavioral maintenance. The documents revealed that Crawford viewed her exactly as he viewed his textile machinery, as a piece of equipment that required occasional servicing to maintain optimal performance. Anna's transformation from compliant wife to desperate rebel was swift and terrible. She began by refusing to perform her domestic duties, a violation so shocking that Crawford initially assumed she was ill. When medical examination revealed no physical ailment, Crawford contacted Pemberton Academy for advice on correcting his defective purchase. The Academy's solution was the domestic recalibration program, a brutal reconditioning process designed to repair malfunctioning graduates. Anna was returned to the Academy like a broken appliance, stripped of her married name and status, and subjected to punishments that made her original training seem gentle by comparison. The recalibration process began with complete isolation. Anna was placed in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, with no light, no human contact, and minimal food. The goal was to break down her rebuilt personality and start the conditioning process from scratch. But Anna's resistance had grown beyond what the Academy's methods could handle. After 2 weeks of isolation failed to break her spirit, the Academy escalated to physical punishment. Anna was subjected to the humility correction, a process that involved public beatings, while being forced to recite acknowledgments of her worthlessness. The other girls were required to watch these sessions as reminders of what happened to those who forgot their place. But Anna refused to break. Each punishment seemed to strengthen her resolve rather than weaken it. She began communicating with other girls, sharing what she had learned about the true nature of their situation. Her influence started spreading through the Academy like a virus, infecting other girls with dangerous ideas about their worth and rights. The Academy's response was swift and brutal. Anna was declared irreparably damaged and sentenced to the terminal correction protocol. This involved a series of treatments designed not to recondition her, but to destroy her completely as an example to others. The process included forced drugging with laudanum to induce permanent mental impairment, physical mutilation to make her unmarketable, and finally, commitment to an asylum under a fabricated diagnosis of hereditary insanity. Dr. Grimsby's notes on Anna's final treatment reveal the cold calculation behind her destruction. Subject shows complete resistance to reconditioning. Recommend immediate termination of correction efforts and disposal through standard channels. Brain appears fundamentally defective, unsuitable for further conditioning attempts. Anna's fate sent shockwaves through the other rebels. 3 girls who had been inspired by her example immediately returned to complete compliance, terrified by what they had witnessed. But Anna's influence had already spread beyond Pemberton Academy, reaching other institutions and even some wives who had discovered the truth about their purchases. Margaret Thornfield, a graduate of the Whitmore Institute for Young Ladies, had been following Anna's story through underground communication networks that the women had established. When news of Anna's destruction reached her, Margaret made the desperate decision to flee her situation entirely, becoming one of the first women to attempt a complete escape from the marriage trade system. Margaret's flight from her husband's estate in Yorkshire was carefully planned. She had saved money by selling household items, established a false identity, and arranged passage to America, where she hoped to disappear entirely. But the network of marriage brokers, academy administrators, and complicit authorities that supported the wife trade was more extensive than she had imagined. Margaret was captured in Liverpool just hours before her ship was scheduled to depart. The agents who found her weren't police officers, but private contractors hired by her husband to recover his stolen property. Margaret's recapture was celebrated in the marriage trade community as proof that escape was impossible. Resistance was futile, and the system was too powerful to challenge. Her punishment was designed to serve as a warning to other potential rebels. Instead of being returned to her husband or sent for reconditioning, Margaret was sold to a group of men who specialized in breaking rebellious women through systematic sexual assault and torture. The process was legal under Victorian law, which gave husbands absolute rights over their wives' bodies and allowed them to delegate those rights to others. Margaret survived 18 months of this treatment before she died. Her death recorded as suicide due to moral insanity. But her death had accomplished what her escape attempt could not. It had shown other women the absolute horror of what they were fighting against, and some of them began to realize that perhaps there were worse things in the marriage trade than they had yet discovered. The marriage market's appetite for fresh merchandise had created a demand that couldn't be satisfied by waiting for girls to reach marriageable age. By the 1870s, a thriving trade in child brides had emerged, where girls as young as 8 were purchased, groomed, and held in reserve for future marriages. This wasn't simply child abuse disguised as betrothal. It was an industrial system for processing children into perfect wives, starting their conditioning before they could even understand what was being done to them. The Ashford estate in Devon operated under the respectable cover of an orphanage and school for disadvantaged girls. In reality, it functioned as a reservation system where wealthy men could purchase and customize their future wives years in advance. The estate's records, discovered during a police investigation in 1889, revealed a business model that treated children like livestock in training. 8-year-old Lucy Pemberton arrived at Ashford in 1874, sold by her impoverished parents for the sum of £15 and the promise that she would receive a proper education befitting a lady. What her parents didn't know was that they had signed documents transferring complete ownership of their daughter to the estate, which would later sell her to the highest bidder when she reached physical maturity. The estate's intake process was methodical and dehumanizing. Lucy was examined by Dr. Harrison Blackthorne, the estate's resident physician, who measured every aspect of her developing body and recorded detailed predictions about her adult appearance. These measurements were used to create what the estate called a maturation projection, essentially a business plan for maximizing the child's eventual sale value. Lucy's file contained disturbing entries tracking her development. Subject shows promise for above-average height and pleasing proportions. Facial structure suggests beauty potential. Recommend premium conditioning track with emphasis on artistic accomplishments and domestic excellence. Estimated mature value, 500–800 pounds. The conditioning began immediately, but it was far more sophisticated than the academy system used on older girls. The estate's approach was to shape the children's entire understanding of reality from the beginning, creating women who would never question their role because they had never known any other possibility. The children were divided into different conditioning tracks based on their projected sale value. Lucy was placed in the premium track, reserved for girls who showed potential for sale to the highest tier of buyers. Her education included music, French, and advanced domestic arts, but every lesson was designed to reinforce her primary purpose as a future wife and mother. The estate's most disturbing innovation was the Future Husband Preparation Program. Beginning at age 10, each girl was assigned to serve a specific adult male visitor to the estate, learning his preferences and adapting her behavior to please him. These men were often the actual buyers who had purchased the girls for future delivery, visiting regularly to monitor their development and ensure their investment was progressing satisfactorily. Lucy was assigned to serve Lord Hamilton Westbrook, a widowed aristocrat who had purchased her future marriage rights for £400. Westbrook visited the estate monthly to observe Lucy's progress, bringing gifts and treats while establishing the emotional bond that would make her grateful for his eventual ownership of her. The grooming process was psychologically sophisticated. Westbrook was presented to Lucy as her special friend and future protector, someone who cared about her development and wanted to ensure her happiness. Lucy was taught to look forward to his visits, to seek his approval, and to measure her self-worth by his satisfaction with her progress. By age 12, Lucy had been conditioned to see her future marriage to Westbrook as the greatest possible achievement of her life. She spent hours preparing for his visits, practicing the specific ways he liked his tea served, learning his favorite musical pieces, and rehearsing conversations that would demonstrate her intelligence without challenging his authority. The estate maintained detailed records of this grooming process, documenting every interaction between the children and their future owners. The files reveal a system designed to create women who would never question their circumstances because they had been taught from childhood that their purpose was to serve their designated husband. But the estate's records also revealed something even more horrifying. Not all of the children were being prepared for traditional marriages. Some were being conditioned for what the estate euphemistically called specialized placements, arrangements that involved multiple buyers or buyers with particular appetites for controlling and degrading their property. The case of 10-year-old Sarah Mitchell illustrates the depths of this depravity. Sarah had been purchased by a consortium of 3 men who intended to share ownership of her once she matured. Her conditioning involved learning to serve multiple masters, accepting that her body and attention would be divided among several owners, and viewing this arrangement as normal and desirable. Sarah's training records describe sessions where she was taught to switch personalities depending on which owner she was serving, becoming whatever each man desired while maintaining enthusiasm for all of them. The psychological damage of this conditioning was so severe that by age 14, Sarah had developed what the estate's physician described as beneficial dissociation, the ability to mentally detach from her own experiences while maintaining perfect behavioral compliance. As Lucy approached her 16th birthday, the date set for her delivery to Westbrook, she had been so thoroughly conditioned that she genuinely looked forward to her wedding as the culmination of her life's purpose. She had no concept that other possibilities existed for women, no understanding that marriage could be anything other than total submission to a man who owned her completely. The estate's success rate was remarkable. Over 90% of their graduates never attempted to resist their marriages or seek escape. They had been shaped from childhood to find fulfillment only in serving their owners, to interpret any unhappiness as personal failure, and to view their conditioning as loving preparation for their natural destiny. But this industrial-scale processing of children into wives had created a problem that would eventually expose the entire system. When the estate's operation was finally discovered, the evidence of what had been done to hundreds of children over decades would prove too shocking for even Victorian society to ignore or cover up. The end came not through moral awakening or legal intervention, but through fire and the grotesque revelations that emerged from the ashes. On November 15, 1889, the Ashford estate was consumed by a blaze that started in the estate's record room and spread so quickly that it trapped most of the occupants inside. What investigators found in the aftermath would expose the full scope of the child bride trade and reveal horrors that shocked even the hardened officials who thought they had seen everything. The fire began at 3 a.m. when Dr. Blackthorne, now elderly and increasingly paranoid about exposure, attempted to destroy the estate's most incriminating documents. But the blaze spread faster than he anticipated, igniting the building's old wooden interior and trapping 63 children and staff members on the upper floors. The screams that awakened the nearby village could be heard for miles, witnesses later testified, describing sounds that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. When the fire department finally controlled the blaze 12 hours later, they discovered a scene that defied comprehension. The estate's interior had collapsed, creating a hellish landscape of charred beams and melted metal. But it was what they found in the estate's basement that would transform a tragic fire into one of the most shocking scandals of the Victorian era. The basement had been protected from the worst of the fire by its stone construction, preserving Dr. Blackthorne's secret laboratory, where he had conducted experiments on the children to optimize their conditioning. The room contained medical equipment that belonged in a torture chamber rather than a physician's office, devices designed to measure and modify every aspect of the girl's physical and psychological development. The centerpiece of the laboratory was what Blackthorne had called the compliance apparatus, a chair equipped with restraints and electrical devices used to condition the children's responses to authority. The chair was surrounded by detailed charts tracking each child's resistance levels, pain thresholds, and psychological breaking points. The walls were lined with jars containing preserved body parts, trophies from children who had died during the conditioning process. But the most damning evidence was found in Blackthorne's private study, where a fireproof safe had protected his personal records. These documents revealed that the Ashford estate was just one facility in a network of similar institutions operating across England and Scotland. The trade in child brides was not an isolated operation, but a coordinated industry involving hundreds of participants at every level of society. The correspondence in Blackthorn's files implicated members of parliament, judges, church officials, and wealthy industrialists. One letter from a sitting judge discussed his purchase of twin sisters aged 9, noting his plans to develop them in complementary directions to maximize their utility. Another, from a prominent minister, detailed his theological justification for the practice, arguing that early conditioning created more devout and submissive Christian wives. The financial records were equally damning. The estate had processed over 800 children during its 20-year operation, generating profits equivalent to millions of dollars in modern currency. The buyers included some of the most respected names in Victorian society, men whose public advocacy for morality and family values masked their participation in systematic child abuse. As investigators worked through the evidence, they began to understand the true scope of the horror. The children who died in the fire had been the fortunate ones. Those who survived their conditioning and were delivered to their buyers had endured fates that the investigators struggled to document. Follow-up investigations into the estate's graduates found that most had died young, victims of the physical and psychological damage inflicted during their conditioning. The autopsy reports from the fire victims revealed the physical toll of the conditioning process. Many of the children showed signs of repeated trauma, surgical modifications, and evidence of drug administration designed to stunt their emotional development while maintaining their physical appeal. Dr. Edwin Marsh, the coroner who performed the examinations, wrote in his official report that the children's bodies showed systematic alterations consistent with preparation for sexual servitude. The investigation's most horrifying discovery came when they located some of the estate's living graduates. Lucy Pemberton, now 21 and married to Lord Westbrook for 5 years, was found in a state that defied medical explanation. Her conditioning had been so complete that she had lost the ability to function independently. She could only respond to direct commands from her husband, had no memory of life before the estate, and showed symptoms of what modern psychology would recognize as complex trauma and dissociative disorders. When investigators attempted to interview Lucy, she could only repeat phrases she had been taught to recite about her gratitude for her husband's care and her joy in serving his needs. Medical examination revealed that she had been subjected to surgical procedures designed to prevent her from experiencing sexual pleasure while maintaining her ability to provide it to her husband. Her conditioning had literally rewired her brain to find fulfillment only in her own degradation. The public reaction to these revelations was swift and brutal. Riots broke out in London when the names of prominent buyers were published in the newspapers. Several implicated officials committed suicide rather than face prosecution, while others fled the country with whatever assets they could liquidate quickly. But the most shocking aspect of the scandal was how quickly it was contained and forgotten. Within 6 months, newspaper coverage had ceased, court proceedings were moved to closed sessions, and most of the evidence was sealed under national security provisions. The powerful men who had participated in the trade used their influence to bury the story, ensuring that their crimes would be hidden from history. The official record states that the Ashford estate fire was a tragic accident that killed 63 people. The investigation findings were classified and remain sealed to this day. Lord Westbrook continued to serve in Parliament until his death in 1923, never facing charges for his crimes. Lucy Pemberton disappeared from all records after 1890, her fate unknown. The Victorian marriage trade didn't end with the Ashford scandal. It simply became more discreet. The industrial processing of women and children into sexual property continued in modified forms, protected by the same powerful interests that had created it. The fire had consumed the evidence and the witnesses, but the appetite for human merchandise remained unchanged. Today, historians estimate that over 10,000 women and children were processed through these institutions during the height of the Victorian marriage trade. Their stories remain buried in sealed archives and destroyed records, their suffering hidden behind the respectable facade of an era that prided itself on moral superiority. The Ashford estate fire had revealed the truth about Victorian society's treatment of women and children, But that truth proved too horrifying to acknowledge and too profitable to abandon.